On February 9th, 1983, Harold Beale made his final log entry at 11:47 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. He noted signal strength, frequency drift, and atmospheric conditions in the same cramped handwriting he had used for 14 years of continuous observation. At 11:52, his wife Margaret heard him climb the stairs from the converted barn. She heard the kitchen door open. She heard nothing after that. The Whatcom County Sheriff's Department ruled it a voluntary disappearance. Case closed in 6 days. But they never explained why Beale left behind his glasses, his heart medication, and 47 composition notebooks containing what he called proof that someone was listening to the listeners. Or why his final entry ended mid-sentence with the words, "Signal origin confirmed. Source is..." Greta Lund had covered the fishing industry for the Bellingham Herald for 11 years. Cannery strikes, quota disputes, the slow death of family operations bought out by corporate fleets. She knew how to make people talk about money, about loss, about the things that kept them up at night. But in March of 1983, her editor handed her a different kind of assignment. A letter had arrived at the paper, forwarded from the county sheriff. Margaret Beale wanted someone to look at her husband's notebooks. The sheriff had returned them after photographing the final pages, and Margaret believed they contained something important, something worth understanding.
What kind of notebooks?
Her editor shrugged.
Radio stuff. Frequencies, signal logs. The wife says he was tracking something for 14 years. Sheriff says he was a hobbyist who wandered off. Either way, it's a human interest piece. The eccentric and his radios.
Greta took the address. She had no idea she was about to spend the next 8 months of her life in a dead man's barn. The Beale property sat 12 miles east of Bellingham, where the foothills began their slow climb toward Mount Baker. The house was a modest 2-story, built in the 1940s, but the barn behind it had been transformed. Greta could see it from the driveway, cables running from the roof, a forest of antennas sprouting at odd angles, a generator shed with fresh tire tracks in the mud beside it. Margaret Beale met her at the door. She was 63 years old, with the kind of stillness that comes from weeks of waiting for news that never arrives.
He wasn't crazy. I need you to understand that before you go in there.
I'm not here to judge him, Mrs. Beale. Everyone judges him. The sheriff did. The FBI agent did.
Greta stopped.
The FBI came here twice. They took photographs, asked questions about his military service. Then they left and never called again.
Margaret led her around the house, toward the barn. The mud sucked at Greta's boots with each step. The barn smelled like solder and old paper. Greta stood in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust. The space had been divided into 3 sections: a workshop with tools hung on pegboard, a library of technical manuals on metal shelving, and what could only be called a listening station. 3 receivers sat on a long wooden bench, their vacuum tubes glowing amber in the dim light. Frequency charts covered the walls, hand-drawn grids with notations in red, blue, and black ink. And everywhere, composition notebooks, stacked on shelves, piled on chairs, arranged in careful rows on the floor.
How many of these are there?
47. He started the first one in 1969. Never missed a day.
Greta picked up the nearest notebook. The cover was labeled in precise block letters. Volume 31, April 1978, September 1978. She opened it to a random page. Dense handwriting filled every line, interrupted by frequency numbers and timestamps.
What was he listening to? Everything. And eventually something that was listening back.
Greta spent the first week reading. She started with Volume 1, dated March 1969, and worked forward. Harold Beale had been methodical to the point of obsession. Each entry followed the same format: date, time, frequency, signal characteristics, weather conditions, and observations. The early notebooks read like the work of a dedicated hobbyist. He logged amateur operators from as far away as New Zealand. He tracked propagation patterns, noting how atmospheric conditions affected signal strength. He built his own receivers, documenting each modification with circuit diagrams and performance notes. But somewhere around Volume 12, dated 1974, something changed. Beale began tracking a different kind of signal. Not voice transmissions or Morse code, but what he called structural anomalies. Brief bursts of noise that appeared at irregular intervals across multiple frequencies. He logged their timing, duration, and spectral characteristics. He built equipment specifically to detect them. By Volume 20, he had given them a name: echoes. On her 8th day in the barn, Greta found a hand-drawn map tucked into Volume 15. It showed the Pacific Northwest from the Canadian border to Northern California, with dozens of small circles marked in red ink. Each circle was labeled with a date and a frequency. She studied it for an hour before she understood what she was looking at.
Mrs. Beale, these circles on the map, did Harold ever explain what they represented?
Margaret was sitting in the doorway, knitting. She had taken to keeping Greta company in the afternoons.
Triangulation points. He said he could determine where the echoes were coming from by measuring the time delay between receivers. He had multiple receivers. He built a network. Other hobbyists, people he corresponded with, they would log the same signals simultaneously, then compare notes. How many people were in this network? At its peak, 14. Spread from Vancouver to Eugene.
Greta looked at the map again. The circles clustered in 3 distinct regions. All of them were in remote, forested areas. All of them were on federal land. Greta drove to the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office on a Tuesday morning. Deputy Frank Harmon had handled the Beale case. He was a large man in his 50s with the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades explaining disappointment to grieving families.
Mrs. Beale's been calling every week. I appreciate you taking this on.
I'm not sure what I'm taking on yet. Can you walk me through what happened?
Not much to walk through. Man goes out for air, doesn't come back. No signs of struggle, no blood, no ransom demand. Vehicle still in the driveway. Wallets on the dresser.
His wife says the FBI visited.
Harmon's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes.
They identified themselves as federal, showed credentials, asked about his radio equipment, his military background. Then they left.
Did they take anything?
Not while I was present. But I wasn't present the whole time.
What does that mean?
It means I got called away, and when I came back they were gone. And so were some of his notebooks.
Greta wrote that down. Margaret Beale served coffee in the kitchen while Greta asked about the missing notebooks.
I counted them after the sheriff returned the others. Volumes 8, 9, and 10 are gone.
And volume 43.
What years do those cover? 8 through 10 would be 72 and 73. 43 was last summer, July through October.
Greta made a note. The early volumes coincided with when Beale first started tracking the echoes. Volume 43 was recent, just 4 months before he disappeared.
Did Harold ever mention anyone following him, watching the house?
Not directly, but he became more careful in the last year. He started encoding his notes, using abbreviations only he understood.
Why?
He said the echoes had changed. They weren't random anymore. They were responding.
Greta set down her coffee.
Responding to what? To him. To his transmissions. He started sending test signals in 1981, and something started sending them back.
That night, Greta sat in her apartment in Bellingham and spread her notes across the kitchen table. She had been a reporter long enough to recognize patterns, and she had been a skeptic long enough to distrust them. Harold Beale was either a meticulous researcher who had stumbled onto something real, or a lonely man whose hobby had become an obsession. The evidence pointed both ways. His methodology was rigorous: triangulation, corroborating witnesses, controlled experiments. But his conclusions were impossible. Signals that responded to human contact. Transmission sources that appeared on federal land and then vanished. A network of listeners who had all, according to Margaret, stopped responding to correspondence in the past 18 months. Greta picked up the list of names Margaret had given her. 14 amateur radio operators spread across 3 states. She would start making calls in the morning. Someone would remember something. Someone always did. She didn't know yet that 4 of them were dead. The first name on the list was Carl Ostrander, a retired electrician in Eugene, Oregon. The number had been disconnected. Greta called the Eugene Register Guard and asked to speak with their obituary desk.
Ostrander, Carl. Yes, here it is. Passed away, September 1982. Heart attack.
The second name was Dennis Fitch, a high school physics teacher in Spokane. Also disconnected. Another call to another newspaper.
Fitch. We had a Dennis Fitch in April of '82. Hiking accident. Fell from a trail in Riverside State Park.
The third name was Marianne Kepler, a librarian in Portland. Her husband answered. My wife passed last August. Car accident on Highway 26. Who is this? Why are you asking about her? Greta apologized and hung up. She sat very still for a long time. Then she picked up the list and began counting. 14 names. 4 confirmed dead in the past 18 months. All from accidents. All natural causes. All people who had been helping Harold Beale track signals that came from nowhere. Greta drove back to the Beale property the next morning with a different set of questions. Margaret was in the barn, sitting in Harold's chair, not touching anything.
Mrs. Beale, I need you to tell me about the network, the people Harold worked with. I gave you the list. 4 of them are dead.
Margaret's hands tightened on the armrests of the chair.
Which ones? Ostrander, Fitch, Kepler, and I'm still checking the others. All in the past 18 months. All accidents. Harold said, he said something was wrong. He said people were getting quiet, stopping their reports. He thought they were scared. Scared of what? He didn't know. But he kept working. He said if he stopped, it would all be for nothing.
Greta looked at the receivers, still glowing amber on the bench. The notebooks, still stacked in their careful rows. The hand-drawn charts, still covering the walls.
Did he ever say who might want him to stop?
Margaret Beale pulled a folder from beneath a stack of technical manuals. Inside were letters, dozens of them, typed on government stationery.
These started arriving in 1980. Harold was filing interference complaints with the FCC. He said someone was jamming his equipment, blocking the frequencies he needed to monitor.
Greta flipped through the letters, form responses mostly. Thank you for your correspondence. We have noted your concerns. But one letter, dated March 1981, was different. It bore the letterhead of a regional FCC office in Seattle, and it was signed by someone named R. Dutton.
What did this one say? Read it.
Greta read aloud.
Mr. Beale, your continued inquiries regarding signal activity in the 7 to 12 megahertz range have been forwarded to the appropriate federal authorities. We recommend you cease monitoring these frequencies and focus your hobby activities on the amateur bands for which you are licensed. Further correspondence on this matter will not receive a response.
Greta looked up.
Who's R. Dutton? Harold tried to find out. The FCC said no one by that name worked there.
Greta spent 3 days trying to reach anyone at the FCC who could confirm or deny the existence of R. Dutton. She was transferred 17 times. She left messages that were never returned. She finally reached a records clerk in Washington, D.C., who told her, off the record, that the Seattle regional office had been reorganized in 1982, and that personnel files from before the reorganization were not available for public inquiry.
I can tell you there's no R. Dutton currently employed by the Commission. Beyond that, I can't help you.
What about the frequencies Beale was monitoring? 7 to 12 megahertz. Who uses those?
That's the shortwave band. International broadcasters, maritime services, some military applications, and amateur operators, of course.
And if someone was transmitting on those frequencies without authorization?
There was a long pause.
That would be a federal matter. Enforcement would depend on who was transmitting and why.
The line went dead. Greta tried calling back, The number had been disconnected. The remaining names on Beale's network list led Greta across 3 states over the next 2 weeks. Of the 14 original members, 4 were confirmed dead, 3 had moved with no forwarding address, and 2 refused to speak with her. That left 5. Only 1 was willing to meet in person. Walter Jessup lived in the trailer park outside Tacoma. He was 71 years old, a Korean War veteran who had worked as a radio operator for the Merchant Marine before retiring in 1975. His trailer was small but immaculate, and his radio equipment, older than Beale's but equally well maintained, filled half the living space.
I knew you'd come eventually. Someone always does.
What do you mean?
After Carl died, I figured someone would start asking questions. I just thought it would be the FBI again, not a reporter.
Again?
They came in October. 2 men, dark suits, asked about my correspondence with Harold, asked about the echoes.
Greta leaned forward.
What did you tell them?
Inside the trailer, Jessup poured 2 cups of coffee from a percolator that looked older than Greta. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady.
I told them I was a hobbyist, that Harold and I exchanged technical information, that I didn't know anything about any echoes.
But that wasn't true.
Of course it wasn't true. I logged those signals for 8 years. I built a receiver specifically to detect them. Harold and I talked every week about what we were finding.
So why lie?
Jessup set down his coffee cup. He looked at his radio equipment, then at the window, then at Greta.
Because Carl told the truth, and Carl is dead. Because Dennis told the truth, and Dennis is dead. Because everyone who put their real findings in writing is either dead or too scared to answer their telephone.
What truth? What were you actually finding?
I don't know what we found. Harold was the one putting it together. All I know is what I logged.
Then tell me what you logged.
Jessup pulled a cardboard box from beneath his bed. Inside were notebooks, not as many as Beale's collection, but similar in format. He opened one dated 1977.
The signals appeared at irregular intervals, never the same frequency twice in a row, but always within the same range, 7 to 12 megahertz. They lasted between 3 and 15 seconds, and they had a structure.
What kind of structure?
Repeating patterns, not random noise. Harold called them pulse trains. He said they were too regular to be natural, too irregular to be standard broadcast.
Could they have been military?
That's what we thought at first. Some kind of experimental communication system. But military signals come from bases, from ships, from known locations. These came from nowhere.
Nowhere.
We triangulated them. The source points moved, not like a vehicle, too fast for that. They would appear in one location, then appear 200 miles away 30 seconds later. No aircraft, no satellite could do that in 1977.
Greta studied Jessup's notebooks for 3 hours. His logging methodology matched Beale's exactly. Timestamps, frequencies, signal characteristics, weather conditions. And like Beale's records, his entries showed a clear progression. The signals appeared more frequently as the years went on. Their patterns became more complex. And starting in 1980, they began to correlate with other events.
What are these notations? The ones marked with asterisks.
Those are the ones Harold flagged. Signals that appeared within 24 hours of incidents.
What kind of incidents?
Equipment failures, power outages, car accidents.
Greta felt something cold settle in her stomach.
Accidents involving people in the network?
Not at first. At first it was just equipment. Receivers would burn out, antennas would come down. Then, in 81, Carl had his first heart attack. He survived that one. The signal log shows unusual activity on his frequency range 2 days before.
That could be coincidence.
It could be, but Harold didn't believe in coincidence, and neither do I anymore.
Before Greta left, Jessup gave her something unexpected. A reel-to-reel tape.
Harold sent this in December, right before he disappeared. I haven't listened to it. I don't want to know what's on it.
Why give it to me?
Because someone should hear it. And because I'm too old to be scared anymore. but I'm also too old to do anything about it. You're young. You're a reporter. Maybe you can find out what Harold found out. And maybe you can tell people without ending up like him.
Greta took the tape. It was labeled in Beale's handwriting. Recording 47C, December 8th, 1982. Source confirmation.
Do you have any idea what source confirmation means?
No, but Harold was excited when he called about it. He said he finally had proof. Proof that the signals weren't random, weren't natural, weren't military. Proof that something was out there, and it knew we were listening.
Greta drove back to Bellingham with the tape on the passenger seat, trying not to think about what might be recorded on it. Margaret Beale had a reel-to-reel player in the barn, the same model Harold had used to make his recordings. Greta threaded the tape with hands that weren't quite steady. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching.
He made hundreds of recordings. Most of them are just static and noise. This one is labelled source confirmation. Does that mean anything to you? Harold used that phrase when he triangulated a signal successfully, when he could pinpoint where it was coming from.
Greta pressed play. For 30 seconds, there was nothing but the hiss of tape. Then, faintly, a sound emerged. It was rhythmic, pulsing, rising and falling in intensity. It sounded almost like breathing. And beneath it, barely audible, was something else. A pattern. A sequence of tones that repeated every 7 seconds. Then, Harold Beale's voice, recorded from a distance, as if he had left the microphone running while he worked. Signal acquired at 11:43 p.m. Frequency 9.73 megahertz. Source bearing confirmed at... His voice stopped. When it resumed, it was barely a whisper. Beale, that's not possible. That's directly overhead. The recording continued for another 4 minutes. Harold Beale's voice appeared twice more. Once to note the signal duration, once to record what he called response behavior. Then there was a loud burst of static, and the tape went silent.
What did he mean, directly overhead? I don't know. Harold never mentioned that to me. He triangulated the source. He determined its bearing. And he said it was overhead. Not coming from a ground station, not from a ship. From above. Maybe he was wrong. He spent 14 years perfecting his methodology. You said it yourself, he wasn't crazy. He was meticulous.
Greta rewound the tape and played it again. The rhythmic pulsing, the repeating tones, the whispered impossibility.
Did Harold have any contact with the military, the Air Force? Anyone who might know about experimental aircraft or satellites? No. He tried. They never responded to his inquiries.
Greta made a note. Someone had responded. Someone had sent R. Dutton's letter. Someone had taken 4 notebooks. Someone had visited Walter Jessup asking about echoes. And someone knew exactly where Harold Beale was listening. The next morning, Greta drove to the Bellingham Public Library and requested every newspaper from the Pacific Northwest published in the week following each death on Beale's network list. It took her 3 days to find what she was looking for. Carl Ostrander, heart attack, September 1982. The Eugene Register Guard obituary mentioned he was found at his radio station. What it didn't mention, what Greta found in a 2-paragraph police brief 3 days later, was that his radio equipment had been destroyed. Electrical fire, the report said. Spontaneous failure of multiple components. Dennis Fitch, hiking accident, April 1982. The Spokesman Review reported he fell from a trail. A follow-up story, buried on page 7, noted that his home had been burglarized while he was in the hospital. Nothing taken except radio equipment and notebooks. Marianne Kepler, car accident, August 1982. The Oregonian carried a brief mention of the accident. It did not mention that her car had experienced sudden electrical failure before leaving the road. Greta sat in the library's reading room, surrounded by microfilm printouts, and understood for the first time that she was not investigating a disappearance. She was investigating a pattern. Greta called her editor from a payphone outside the library.
You've been on this story for 6 weeks. I need something I can publish.
I have something.
I just don't know what it is yet.
That's not helpful.
Listen to me. 4 people are dead. At least 4. They were all connected to Beale, they were all tracking the same signals, and they all died within 18 months of each other. Their equipment was destroyed or stolen, their records are gone. And someone from the federal government visited at least 2 of them before they died.
There was a long silence on the line.
You're talking about a conspiracy.
I'm talking about a pattern. Conspiracy is your word.
Greta, this is a small paper. We cover fishing and county politics. We don't cover federal conspiracies.
Then what do you want me to do?
Write the human interest piece. The eccentric with his radios. Leave the rest of it alone.
Greta hung up. She stood in the phone booth for a long time, watching traffic pass on the street outside. Then she drove back to the Beale property. Something was wrong at the Beale property. Greta knew it before she turned into the driveway. The barn door was open. It had been closed when she left that morning. She found Margaret in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. Her face was the color of old paper.
What happened? Men came. 2 of them. They had a warrant. They took the recordings. What recordings? The tape from Jessup. All of them. Every tape Harold ever made. They had a truck. It took them an hour to load it all.
Greta moved to the window and looked at the barn. The door stood open, revealing the interior. The receivers were still there. The notebooks were still there. But the shelf where Harold had kept his recordings, hundreds of reels, 14 years of documented signals, was empty.
Did they say anything? Give any explanation? They said the recordings contained classified frequency information. They said I could contest the seizure in court, but the materials would remain in federal custody until a judge reviewed them. Did you get their names? Their agency? They wouldn't say. They just kept calling it a national security matter.
Greta spent the next week trying to find out who had taken the recordings. The Whatcom County Sheriff's Office had no record of any warrant. The FBI field office in Seattle claimed no knowledge of the seizure. The FCC regional administrator said the matter was outside their jurisdiction. Every call led to another dead end. On the 8th day, she received a phone call at her apartment. The voice was male, calm, and unfamiliar.
Miss Lund, you've been making a lot of inquiries.
Who is this?
Someone who's been following your work. You're asking questions about Harold Beale, about the network, about the recordings.
How do you know what I'm asking about?
Because we've been listening. We've always been listening. That's the point, isn't it? Harold figured that out. The signals weren't random. They were targeted. They knew who was paying attention.
Greta's hand tightened on the receiver.
Who is they?
That's the wrong question. The right question is, why did they stop?
The line went dead. Greta couldn't sleep that night. She sat in her kitchen with the lights off, watching the street below. The caller had known her name, knew what questions she was asking, knew about the network, the recordings, everything. But one thing he had said stuck with her. Why did they stop? The signals. Harold had been tracking them for 14 years. Jessup said they appeared more frequently as time went on, became more complex. And then, according to the anonymous caller, they stopped. She pulled out her notes and began cross-referencing dates. Harold's final log entry was February 9th, 1983. The last recorded signal in Jessup's notebooks was January 28th of the same year. 12 days apart. Greta found the clipping she had saved from the Bellingham Herald. A small item, page 6, dated January 30th, 1983. Military exercise scheduled. Residents of Whatcom County may notice increased aircraft activity over the next several weeks as the Air Force conducts routine training operations in the Mount Baker Wilderness area. The signal stopped. And then the military arrived. The next morning, Greta drove to the Whatcom County Recorder's office. She requested all public records related to federal land use in the Mount Baker Wilderness area for the past 5 years.
That's a lot of material. Could take a few days to pull together.
I'll wait.
It took 4 hours. The clerk emerged with 2 boxes of documents: permits, environmental assessments, land surveys, and correspondence between county officials and federal agencies. Greta spread them across a reading table and began sorting. Most of it was routine: timber sales, trail maintenance, wildlife surveys. But buried in the second box, she found something different. A series of permits issued to an entity called the Northwest Research Initiative, dated between 1976 and 1982. The permits authorized equipment installation and maintenance at 3 locations in the wilderness area. Greta looked at the coordinates. Then she pulled out Harold Beale's hand-drawn map from her bag and compared them. 2 of the 3 locations matched exactly with circles Harold had marked in red ink, points where he had triangulated the source of the echoes. The Northwest Research Initiative was not listed in any directory Greta could find. No phone number, no address, no corporate registration. The permits listed a contact name, Dr. R. Harker, and a mailing address in Seattle that turned out to be a post office box. She drove to Seattle the next day. The post office was a small branch in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. The clerk behind the counter was young, barely out of high school.
I'm trying to reach the holder of P.O. Box 4732.
I can't give out that information.
I'm not asking for a name. I'm asking if the box is still active.
The clerk hesitated, then checked a ledger.
Box was closed in... looks like January of this year.
1983.
That's right. January 15th. Mail forwarding was requested to... That's weird.
What?
Forwarding address is just General Delivery, Glacier, Washington. That's not even a real post office. It's just a store that handles mail for the backcountry.
Glacier was the last town before the Mount Baker Wilderness. Greta wrote down the address. Drive to Glacier took 3 hours on winding mountain roads. The town, if it could be called that, consisted of a general store, a gas station, and a scattering of cabins serving as weekend retreats for hikers and skiers. The general store had a hand-painted sign that read U.S. Post Office and smelled like wood smoke and beef jerky.
Help you? I'm looking for someone who might have been receiving mail here. An organization called the Northwest Research Initiative.
The storekeeper was a woman in her 60s, weathered by mountain winters. Her expression didn't change, but her hands stopped moving.
Who's asking?
I'm a reporter. I'm investigating a disappearance.
The radio man. Beale.
You know about him?
Everyone around here knows. He used to come through, asking about the equipment. The installations up in the backcountry.
What installations?
That's the thing. Nobody knows exactly what they are. Government put them up back in '76. Said it was research equipment. Weather stations, seismic monitors, that kind of thing.
But
weather stations don't hum at night, and seismic monitors don't need armed guards.
The storekeeper's name was Ruth Halverson. She had lived in Glacier for 40 years and knew every trail, every cabin, and every person who passed through. She told Greta about the installations while they drank coffee in the back room.
3 of them, up in the backcountry. The closest is about 4 miles from here, up the Nooksack River Trail. I've seen it from a distance. Metal building about the size of a shed, antenna array on top, fence around the perimeter.
did you ever see anyone working there?
Never. But I heard them. Helicopters mostly. They come in at night, stay a few hours, then leave. Started in '76. Happened regular for years. Then, about 2 months ago, they stopped.
January?
Around then. Everything went quiet. The installations are still there, but nobody's tending them anymore.
How do you know?
Because the humming stopped. Those things used to put out a sound you could hear from a mile away if the wind was right. Now there's nothing. Just the wind and the trees.
Greta finished her coffee and asked for directions to the nearest installation. The trail followed the Nooksack River for 3 miles before branching into the backcountry. Greta hiked alone, her breath visible in the cold mountain air. The forest here was old growth, massive Douglas firs and western red cedars that blocked most of the sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a raven. She found the installation after 4 hours of hiking. It was exactly as Ruth had described. A metal building, perhaps 20 feet square, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. An antenna array rose from the roof. Not a simple weather station setup, but a complex arrangement of dishes and towers. Warning signs hung on the fence. No trespassing. Federal property. Authorized personnel only. The building was dark. No lights, no sound, no sign of activity. Greta walked the perimeter of the fence, looking for any indication of what the installation was for. She found a small plaque bolted to one of the fence posts. It read, Northwest Research Initiative, Site 2, established 1976, and beneath that, in smaller letters, Signal Acquisition and Analysis. Greta returned to Bellingham that evening with photographs of the installation and a new set of questions. Signal Acquisition and Analysis. Not weather monitoring, not seismic research. The same thing Harold Beale had been doing in his barn for 14 years. Listening. She spread her evidence across her kitchen table. The timeline was becoming clear. 1976. The government installed listening stations in the Mount Baker wilderness. The same year, Harold Beale's network began detecting unusual signals from those exact locations. For 7 years, both operations ran in parallel. Beale documenting the echoes, the installations presumably doing the same thing. Then, in early 1983, the signal stopped. The installations went dark, and Harold Beale disappeared. 2 possibilities. Either the government was tracking the same signals Beale had discovered and decided to shut down the operation and silence everyone who knew about it, or the government was the source of the signals, and Beale had stumbled onto something he was never supposed to find. Neither explanation accounted for the recording. For Harold's whispered words. That's not possible. That's directly overhead. The next morning, Greta drove to Margaret Beale's house one last time. She found the widow in the barn, sitting among her husband's remaining equipment, staring at the empty shelf where the recordings had been.
I found the installations, 3 of them, up in the wilderness. The government put them there in 76. Harold knew. He tracked them for years. Why didn't he tell anyone? He tried. He wrote letters, made phone calls. Nobody believed him. They said he was imagining things, misinterpreting normal transmissions. But the installations were real. The signals were real. Yes, and so was whatever was transmitting to them.
Greta sat down across from Margaret.
I need you to tell me everything Harold said about the source, the signals that came from overhead. What did he believe he was tracking? He never used the word. He was a scientist, not a believer. But I'll tell you what he told me the night before he disappeared. He said the installations weren't sending signals, they were receiving them. And they were receiving them from something that shouldn't exist.
That night, Greta received another phone call. The same calm voice.
You found the installations.
Who are you?
Someone who worked on the project. Someone who left before it ended.
The Northwest Research Initiative.
That was the name on the paperwork. The real name was never written down. We called it Listener.
What was its purpose?
Signal intelligence. Monitoring. We were tracking something in the shortwave band, something that appeared in 1968 and never went away. Something that didn't match any known transmission source.
The echoes. The signals Harold Beale documented.
Beale was a problem. He built equipment that could detect what we were tracking. He started mapping our installations. He was getting too close.
Too close to what?
There was a long pause.
To understanding what the signals meant. And who was sending them.
Tell me.
I can't. Not over the phone. If you want answers, come to the Glacier General Store tomorrow at noon. Come alone.
The line went dead. Greta arrived at the Glacier General Store at 11:30 the next morning. Ruth Halverson was behind the counter, watching the door.
Someone's waiting for you. Back room.
The man sitting at the table was in his 60s, with the bearing of someone who had spent a career following orders. He wore civilian clothes, but everything about him said military. He didn't stand when Greta entered.
Close the door.
Greta closed it.
My name is Harker. Dr. Robert Harker. I ran the Listener Project from 1974 until January of this year.
You're the one who signed the permits.
Among other things. Sit down, Miss Lund. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. But Harold Beale believed it, and he was right.
What did he believe?
That the signals weren't coming from Earth. That something was out there, watching us, listening to us, and that our government has known about it for 15 years.
Harker spoke for an hour. He described the discovery of the signals in 1968 by a Navy listening post in Alaska, the subsequent investigation that traced them to multiple points across the Pacific Northwest, the installation of monitoring stations disguised as research equipment, and the growing certainty, over 15 years of observation, that the signals were not natural, not human, and not from any known source.
We triangulated them, just like Beale did. And we got the same results he did. The source moved. It appeared at different altitudes, different bearings. Sometimes it was 50,000 feet up. Sometimes it was in orbit.
Why didn't you go public?
Because we didn't understand what we were seeing, and because the signals started responding.
Responding?
When we transmitted test signals, they echoed back, modified, structured, as if something was learning our patterns and reflecting them.
That's what Beale discovered. That's why he called them echoes.
Beale was brilliant. He figured out in his barn what it took us millions of dollars and a team of scientists to understand. And that made him dangerous.
Greta's hand stopped writing.
Dangerous to whom?
To the project, to the people running it. Beale was documenting everything: locations, frequencies, patterns. He was building a public record of something that was never supposed to be public.
So you killed him?
No, I didn't. But someone did.
Harker leaned forward.
The project was shut down in January. Not by me, I was overruled. The decision came from above. Way above. They said the signals had stopped, that there was nothing left to monitor. They ordered the installations deactivated and the records destroyed.
But the signals didn't stop because the phenomenon ended.
No. They stopped because whatever was sending them left. The last transmission we received was December 8th, 1982, the same day Beale made his final recording. After that, nothing. Complete silence.
And Beale?
Beale knew too much. He had recordings, documentation, 14 years of evidence. Someone decided that evidence couldn't exist. I don't know who. I don't know how. But I know they came for him.
Greta sat in silence for a long moment. Then she pulled out her notes, everything she had gathered over 8 months of investigation.
Here's what I know. Harold Beale spent 14 years tracking signals that appeared across the Pacific Northwest. The government was tracking the same signals from installations they built in the wilderness. 4 members of Beale's network died in accidents over 18 months, all of them with equipment destroyed or stolen. Federal agents visited Beale's property, took his recordings and seized his notebooks. And then Beale himself disappeared.
She looked at Harker.
You're telling me this was about alien signals? That the government killed people to cover up contact with extraterrestrial intelligence?
I'm telling you what I observed. The signals were real. The response behavior was real. The source was not terrestrial. What conclusion you draw is up to you.
And what conclusion did the government draw?
That some secrets are worth killing for, and that some questions are better left unanswered.
Greta closed her notebook.
I'm not going to leave them unanswered.
Greta drove back to Bellingham that evening with Harker's testimony recorded on a cassette tape she had hidden in her bag. She had enough now. Enough to write something. Not the human interest piece her editor wanted, but something real. Something that documented what Harold Beale had found, what the government had hidden, and what had happened to the people who got too close to the truth. She stopped at a payphone outside Bellingham and called the one person she trusted.
It's me. I have it. I have everything.
Where are you?
About 10 miles out. I'm coming to see you tonight. I need you to hold on to something for me.
Miss Lund, you should know. Someone was here today, asking about you.
Greta felt the cold spread through her chest.
Who?
I don't know. 2 men, dark car. They wanted to know if I'd heard from you, what you'd found. I told them nothing.
Walter, listen to me. Don't answer the door tonight. Don't answer the phone unless it's me. I'll be there in 2 hours.
Be careful.
Greta hung up and looked at the road ahead. It was getting dark. The dark sedan appeared in Greta's rearview mirror 5 miles outside Tacoma. It kept its distance, never closer than a quarter mile, never falling back farther than half. When she changed lanes, it changed lanes. When she slowed, it slowed. When she turned onto the highway toward Jessup's trailer park, it turned too. She reached Jessup's trailer at 9:15. The lights were off. The door was open.
Walter?
No answer. Greta stepped inside. The trailer had been ransacked, equipment overturned, notebooks scattered across the floor, the cardboard box Jessup had shown her torn apart, and in the middle of it all, Walter Jessup, face down on the linoleum, not moving. She knelt beside him. He was breathing, shallow, but breathing. She could see a bruise forming on the back of his head. She pulled out her notebook and started writing, fast. Everything she knew, every name, every date, every connection. If something happened to her, someone would find it. Someone would understand. Behind her, she heard footsteps on gravel, the door of the dark sedan opening, and a voice she recognized.
Miss Lund, we need to talk.
Greta stood up slowly, her notebook in one hand. The man in the doorway was middle-aged, nondescript, wearing a dark suit. Behind him, another figure waited by the car.
You're the ones who took Beale's recordings, who killed the people in his network.
We're the ones who maintain order, Miss Lund, who ensure that certain discoveries remain managed.
Managed? You mean buried?
I mean controlled. Harold Beale stumbled onto something that could have destabilized everything. The public isn't ready to know what's out there. What's been out there, watching, for decades.
So you killed him?
We contained him, just as we'll contain this.
Greta looked at the notebook in her hand, at Walter Jessup on the floor behind her, at the cassette tape in her bag.
No, you won't.
She had mailed copies of everything, the notes, the photographs, Harker's testimony, to 3 different newspapers that afternoon. Whatever happened next, the story would survive. Harold Beale's 14 years of listening would not be erased. The man stepped forward. Greta did not step back.
You can take me. You can take everything I have on me, but you can't take what I've already sent. The truth is out there now, and someone will find it.
The man stopped. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned and walked back to the car. The engine started. The headlights swept across the trailer park, and the dark sedan disappeared into the night. Greta Lund would spend the next 2 years fighting to publish Harold Beale's story. She would face lawsuits, harassment, and threats. Her editor would fire her. 3 newspapers would refuse to print her work. But in 1985, a small press in Oregon would publish the listener station, the Harold Beale documentation. It would sell 4,000 copies before being pulled from shelves under pressure from federal attorneys. The remaining copies would become collector's items, passed from hand to hand among people who believed that something was out there, and that someone had died trying to prove it. Harold Beale was never found. His widow Margaret died in 1989, still waiting for answers. The installations in the Mount Baker wilderness were dismantled in 1984. Their equipment removed to an unknown location. And the signals, the echoes that Beale had tracked for 14 years, never returned. But in his final notebook, on the page where his last entry ended mid-sentence, Harold Beale had written something in the margin. A note, barely legible, added sometime after the entry itself. It read, "They're not gone. They're just listening differently now." The case remained sealed by court order until 2033.